From the streets we drive on to the systems we rely on every day, this is the work that keeps our communities moving. I'm talking about public works. Welcome to the Public Works Podcast, where we spotlight the people behind the infrastructure, the leaders shaping our communities, and the stories that don't always get told. In this unique episode, I sit down with Tyler Palmer from the city of Moscow, Idaho, a unique community at crossroads of state lines, higher education, and regional collaboration. From navigating the dynamics of a college town to leading in a border city to making an impact through national public works advocacy, this conversation dives into what it means to serve, lead, and push the profession forward. I'm your host for today's episode, Shane Silsby. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Public Works Podcast, where we highlight the people, projects, and the passion behind public works. Today, we've got a great guest, Tyler Palmer from the city of Moscow, Idaho. And Tyler brings a unique perspective from working in a college town, leading in a state border city, and contributing to public works advocacy on a national level. Tyler, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Shane. Happy to be here, man. This is a great project. I've enjoyed keeping up with the podcast. I think it's a great format for public works information. So I'm really happy to get to participate.
That's awesome. Appreciate the support there. And we have Tyler Palmer the first, right? The first, or are we in the lineage here?
I think I'm the first one. Tyler, I don't think there's many. It seems like pre-1980, there are no Tylers, and then we proliferated through the 80s and 90s. And yeah, Tyler's prior to this Tyler.
Okay, got it. All right. So appreciate that. I learned only through you that there was a Moscow, Idaho. I should have known that before, but I was interested in that. And when people say Moscow, they don't always go to Idaho for that. But before we dive into some of the questions I have, can you give us a little quick snapshot about what a day in the life looks like in Moscow, Idaho? We can see the street behind you a little bit. Some people are moving around, but what happens there downtown?
Yeah, you mentioned we're a university town. The land-grant university for the state of Idaho is here. So University of Idaho is in our town. We're in a little bit of a unique situation in that the state of Washington's land-grant university is in Pullman, which is right across the border from us, 7 miles away, Washington State University. And so we have two major land-grant universities within 7 miles of each other. We have, I believe, the highest concentration of graduate degrees anywhere in the country is here. Those relatively small communities. Moscow's about 25-ish thousand people, Pullman about 35,000. Combined, you're looking at 70, 80,000 people, but really in a very concentrated college town type atmosphere. But both of these cities also are the largest cities in their respective counties. And so they serve as the culture centers, shopping centers. Yeah, there's a lot of art and culture and just a lot of different folks from different backgrounds, all that kind of congregate here in this geographically isolated spot in the inland Northwest. It's a unique place to live, but it's also a unique place to apply the trade of public works.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just 7 miles. That's like a trip to the store. So you can pick what state and what college game you wanted to go to or whatever. That's close.
Oh man, yeah. I've had days where I've gone to like breakfast in one city, college football games in each town, and then like dinner in one city and gone to get a nightcap in the other. There's quite a bit of flow between the two, but yeah, it's incredible to be able to engage in the activities that are offered between both of them.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting, I think it's not really in the metropolis area of either states, right? It's kind of on the periphery of the massing of the state populations.
It's one of the challenges to this area is the inland Northwest. We have some of the most expensive just pricing generally. For example, things like road salt. Ours is the most expensive road salt anywhere in the country. And it's just because of the geographic isolation. We're an hour and a half from the closest freeway. There's not a freeway. You have to go up to Spokane, Washington to hit the closest freeway to us. There's no north-south freeway. There's only a highway through the state of Idaho, north-south. We're 5.5 hours from Seattle if you're driving, and we're about 6 hours from Boise. And so, yeah, we're pretty isolated up here.
Wow, interesting. So you got to make it work on your own pretty much, or with a small community.
You got to make it work. It requires some creative collaboration in order to make things work. In addition to being geographically isolated, we're just small. And so generating economies of scale can be interesting because we're having to mobilize a lot of stuff out to us. And when you do that, you don't want to be bearing the entirety of the cost. Routing, timing, collaboration with neighboring entities, all that stuff is on steroids up here.
Cool. Yeah, I think across the country, there could be a little bit of a model for that, with people working together more to try to reduce the burden You're doing it somewhat because you have to, but other agencies maybe should take note. So you're doing all that because you've had a great career in municipal government and public works. Do you want to share with us a little bit about how you went down that path? And you had public works, but you also operated as a deputy city manager or administrator. Talk to
Yeah.
us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, I think Shane, we had the opportunity to serve together on the Government Affairs Committee, which is a really fun thing to dive into. And I'm always interested whenever I talk to anybody in public works about how did you get into public works, especially on the local government level. When you talk to somebody who's a cop or a fireman, if you talk to a 5-year-old kid and you're like, hey, what's a city job? What's a job working for government? You'd like, a lot of times they would say, oh, a policeman. I want to be a fireman. Those are the ones that people are aware of because obviously they're visible. Not a lot of 5-year-olds, if you ask them, say, I want to be a water operator, or even fewer say, I want to be a bureaucrat. Like, I don't think that's high on the scale. And so most people have a kind of I stumbled into this and then realized how wonderful it was story. And I'm no exception. I was certain I was going to go to law school. My dad's an attorney. My grandpa's an attorney. There's a family firm. I'm the oldest son. It was a charted course. And I got into pre-law in my undergrad, and I needed a summer job. And I had found out about a job that the city was hiring. I didn't know what it was hiring for. I just knew the city was hiring. I talked to a friend of a friend whose dad said, hey, you should check with the city. So I applied, and the job that they had posted was a seasonal public works job. And this department was a non-departmentalized public works department. So you did a little bit of everything. But I had no idea what I was getting into. They just said, show up with gloves and steel-toed boots and be there Monday morning. And so I did. And I was a child of the 80s and 90s. The only thing I knew about anything utility systems was that Ninja Turtles lived in the manholes. That was it. I just didn't have any idea how any of it worked, and got into it and just really loved it. I had such a great summer that summer. I was having so much fun, and they had some additional hours. And so they asked me if I wanted to stay on through the winter. And I'm like, yeah, I'd love to stay on through the winter. I'm really enjoying this. And they accommodated my schedule. I continued to study. And that next spring, they actually had a full-time job they approached me about taking. I was hesitant. I said, I'm still going to school. It's important to me to finish my undergrad. But at this point, I really was not enjoying pre-law. And I was just like, I don't know if I want to do law. And I'm loving this, but I didn't really think of it as a career. I just thought, I'm liking this. And so I said, well, yeah, you know what? If you guys will accommodate me, yeah, I'll do it. So by the time I graduated with my undergrad, I'd already decided that I didn't want to go the law route. And I thought, I can make a career out of this. Because by the time I graduated with my undergrad, I was supervising 2 departments. They got sprung on me. My boss just came in. They had a guy that ended up needing to move on, and they said, hey, Tyler, I want you to supervise the street department. And I was just horrified, absolutely horrified. But I dove in. I was like, well, okay, I'll give it a try. And he was a wonderful public works director. He was one of those guys that always pushed and stretched you. I think that, like, when I see leadership, that rather than being insular and withholding opportunity and information, is magnanimous with it and tries to provide opportunity and push, those are always the strongest leaders. They're not leading from an insecure place. And so for him, he was always trying to identify talent and develop it. So it was just like, that time to stretch. And man, it stretched me. It was pretty incredible. So by the time I finished my undergrad, I knew I was really enjoying that. About a year before finishing, I'd gone to my dad, and I was just horrified to have this conversation. I said, I don't think I'm going to do law school. And he said, son, if I had to do over again, I don't think I'd do law school either. I'm like, where was this conversation 2 years ago, man? At that point, I decided that I geared my undergrad toward getting a graduate degree in public administration. Because one of the things that was attractive to me was so many people in public works leadership, and rightfully, come from the engineering side. Go through, get an engineering degree, work in a public sector or private sector, and that's where that engagement happens. But there's not as many of us that come into top administration from the operations side. And so that really was interesting to me, to try and be a voice for the operator through that process. At that point, by the time I graduated, I was what was called a public works supervisor in that system. So I was overseeing water and sewer and storm, streets. And I'd gotten my wastewater operator's license and my water operator's license, and working through those processes. And yeah, at that point, I knew it was my career. I loved it. I got bit by the bug. I think it's such a need-driven industry. There's an inherent practicality in what we do. We don't have the opportunity to get too far afield. And I also just very much enjoy contributing in such a tangible way, in such a basic way. When I were chatting a little earlier, I really do believe that public works in its purest form is what government's supposed to be. It's that thing where the reason we exist at all is because people want to live in close proximity to each other. That's it. People want the opportunity to be around other people. And that's why we're here. And the first question when people quit hunting and gathering and said, hey, actually, you know what? Let's stay here. The very first question became the first government which became the first public works department. It's, well, who's getting the water?
Yeah.
How are we getting rid of the waste? Now that we're not going to the resources, how do we get the resources to us? Oh, we need transportation. And what we do is just this hyper evolved version of that millennia later. To me, it's so fundamentally fun to be a part of that, especially I think during uncertain times where things can feel fuzzy and weird and just unclear. Public works to me always has a clear charge. It's very clear and it's very fundamental. And there's no question about, to me, its inherent goodness. There's a hopefulness in public works that I love. Earlier today, I was participating in the driver's seat session for APWA. And I was telling them, I just finished reading the book, No Country for Old Men. And like most great movies, there's a better book behind it. But at the end of that book, the sheriff character is talking about a memory he had from World War II, where he encounters this hand-chiseled water trough. And he talks about the hopefulness that's inherent in that creation of that thing, because it's going to outlast the person who did it. They might not even live to see it finished, but they're giving that effort toward a future because there's this faith that there is this future and this hope in this future. And I think in those uncertain times like this, that all the more important public works, because so many things that we work on are that. I just finished a water and sewer comp plan where we're looking at a 50-year horizon. I am dead in 50. I'm not going to see this stuff, and I don't care. I want to be a custodian while I'm here and be able to hand it on. So I think that there is something absolutely inspiring about that. And to me, the people that are attracted to that are just some of the best people. And that's why I love the industry. We just get to work with people who are really purely motivated to not necessarily slap their name all over something or have some big grandiose thing. We're generally not the ones that are cutting the ribbon. We're not the ones that are going to name the bridge after or the infrastructure, but we get that quiet satisfaction of knowing that we created something that'll outlive us.
Yeah, there's a lot of good things to dive into there. And those opportunities you were talking about, those were all at Moscow, the city of Moscow?
No, so I worked for two different municipalities in
Okay.
the Salt Lake area prior to moving up to Moscow.
Okay.
I worked for the city of Syracuse and then Clinton City, which are both just suburbs of Salt Lake City. And so I moved up here in 2009. So it's been 17 years, I guess, in June that I've been with the city of Moscow. But I spent the first 4 years of my career with the first city I worked for, Syracuse City. And then I spent another about 4 years with the city of Clinton before moving up here.
Nice. And yeah, I just like what you said about the pureness of public works. And I think it's because in a world where there's a lot of dispute about facts, it's pretty objective what people need and want from the public works infrastructure, right? They want to be able to drive down the road safely. They want clean drinking water. They want the waste to go where it's supposed to go when they flush or throw stuff away. I think everybody pretty much agrees on that in the civilized society. So we're at the axle of all these weird spokes, but everybody agrees on the central points, I think, which makes it a great profession. So appreciate you sharing that with us. You talked about working in a college town. How does that shape the work you do through the city and including public works? And I think when we look at the seasonality of it, those population numbers you gave for Washington State area and University of Idaho area, perhaps those are the baseline populations of the residents, but then those might grow during the school years to whatever the student enrollment is, right? So how does that affect what you do seasonally?
Pretty big. I really appreciate the question because that's a big impact on our systems. When you have a utility system that sees a 30 to 40% fluctuation in usership over the course of the year, depending on the time of the year, it can create some interesting challenges. One with just scope and size. You have to size things like parking, things like just capacity type questions. And it creates some dynamics where there are things that you have to build for peak in most of the systems that we have. My wastewater treatment plant, our water reclamation facility is a great example. A lot of places you'll have some variation based on temperatures and things going on, but we have a biological nutrient removal facility that's highly dependent on the balance between the organisms that are doing the work out there. And maintaining that balance when you have a 40% swing in population is a real challenge. We really have to have those processes super dialed in because we'll see our flows just plummet at certain points of the year. And then we'll see them really spike during other times of the year. And then also we really function largely as tourist towns. When there's a football game in town, when we're this small, there'll be an enormous influx of people, or there'll be a concert at one of the universities, any number of events. And so we'll see a huge influx of people. So there are those challenges that a lot of tourist destinations have to deal with as well, of just like that seasonality, that really acute usage versus kind of a baseline that can vary quite a bit as well. And I guess the other interesting factor of a college town that I think has been really fun and in some ways challenging, but in other ways helpful to deal with, is that we have a lot of academic experts. Both universities have large engineering departments, architecture departments, geology departments, hydrology departments. And so we have a lot of really smart people who are really interested in what we do. We always joke about resident experts. We actually have them. One of the challenges is you can't put out stuff that isn't well vetted, because there's somebody who's going to call you on it. If I say something wrong, I've got some percentage of people who really know that I said something wrong. If we approach something without having really vetted the idea and we're unaware of some option that we should be aware of, we're going to hear about it. And so I think that's another interesting aspect, but it also is super helpful in a lot of ways. For example, at my wastewater treatment facility, there is a scale model of the facility that is run by the University of Idaho's engineering department, because they use that as an opportunity to test things. And so if there's something we want to test, I can get a hold of the professors over there and say, hey, we're considering making some adjustments here and here. Can you see what that does? They've got a scale model. They run it through, they give us some information. We have people who are just so familiar with our facilities that it gives us a lot of great resources. All of our water is drawn from an aquifer system, and it's probably among the most studied aquifer systems in the whole country, certainly, because you have so many graduate students that it's right here and they want to do the research on it. And so there are certainly advantages, but it doesn't come without some of its challenges as well.
That's interesting. So you have the academic resource. Do you also get some human resources from that? Do you get like student internships or people willing to help out from those enrollments?
Yeah, we do. For one, just even with some of our baseline seasonal staff, we'll get some interest. We get some pretty educated people mowing parks during the summer sometimes. Like our engineering department, we have intern programs with our legal department, with our engineering department, and we get really high quality interns that we're able to get in and get plugged in. Historically, that's almost been a challenge for some of our public works positions, like operator positions, in that I think we went through a period in the country where everyone had to go to college. If you didn't go to college, you weren't worth anything, and the trades weren't, that was a secondary thing for someone who couldn't make it in college. I feel like that perception has waned quite a bit. And I think that now there is more of a tendency to recognize the trades as a viable option for a lot of people. And so we've seen that shift some. So certainly the university influence from an employment standpoint, other than just seasonals, has been more acute in some of those trades that do require the degrees, the legal, engineering, those sorts of things. Yeah, there's an impact there as well.
Interesting. And I just thought about this issue. I don't know why it hadn't crossed my mind before, and to the extent you're comfortable answering it, but from an administrative standpoint, you talked about building for the peak, but you have a peak that includes a percentage of people that aren't residents to pay taxes into the system. So have you run into issues like that? Care to share any of that, or is that just, hey, enough of that?
That's a very astute question. We've been working with our state representatives through our Association of Idaho Cities for quite a while, trying to get the state to broaden its definition of a tourist town. They have a definition within the tax code that allows for a local option sales tax if you meet certain provisions, a certain size, a certain percentage of tourism every year. And since we function that way, we've really been working on trying to get them to broaden it so that it would include some of our university towns, to have the cost burden borne by the locals when a lot of the cost isn't being incurred by that. It's a real challenge because we already have a lot of rate pressure just from the fact that it's expensive for us to mobilize work out here. It's expensive for us to buy products. And so we already pay a little bit more than most places do in the country just for pipe, especially if you have to mobilize out any specialty services for surface treatments on the roads or some pipe bursting service. We're always paying mobilization charges that are higher. So we already have some of those pressures. And so if we were able to have the tourism dollar help support the infrastructure more, that would be very helpful. It's not currently available to us, but I think that is just a testament to the need for engaging with government as public works, because telling that story adequately and explaining those impacts is part of what we have to do, rather than just, well, I guess we'll figure it out and we'll deal with it the way we always have. So that's something I hope we get more traction on. We'll see.
Yeah, so that's going to take some partnerships, and I'm sure there's meetings quarterly or annually with the university and others about how to address this issue. But also from a partnership standpoint, you have
another state right next door, right? So you got some border dynamics. You mentioned that in your kind of intro and what happens in the nature of Moscow's location. But how does that influence your work on a daily basis? Do you coordinate with those jurisdictions? And or do they have a whole different set of rules that you drive 3.5 miles of the 7 miles and all of a sudden you've got different regulation? How does that affect your operations and trying to administer things for Moscow?
Yeah, it's not insignificant. Pullman hired a new public works director recently, and he and I had a lengthy meeting on Monday about a number of different issues. The largest one that requires a lot of coordination is that our aquifer system that we both share as the sole source of water is a declining aquifer. And so we work actively on conservation issues in concert, and we're also working on an alternate supply, which will be a regional alternate supply project. But that comes with, exactly like you said, all the complications of a state line, because we have different regulations. We call things different things just across the state line. Like in Idaho, you can't use the term ASR because of the way the regulations are set up. They don't like us to say it's aquifer storage and recovery because that implies that we get whatever water we put in, and we have to call it something different. Just nomenclature even shifts when you cross the state line. Which entity is in charge of what? A big point of collaboration is the water side, but also my wastewater facility discharges right at the state line. For example, there's a temperature provision in my NPDES permit for my wastewater facility that is premised on the temperature standard in the state of Washington. And so we have to coordinate with the Washington regulatory entities to have that looked at, and if there's any adjustment that's merited within that. And so it certainly complicates things when you've got a state border right there and there's that required interaction, because as we well know, water doesn't respect lines on a map, and neither does transportation. Those things just flow between the two. We had our mayors back jointly in DC just this last week. They were back there working on a grant for a road project that we have to help alleviate some traffic out of both downtowns. Just things like that require pretty consistent and constant coordination. We know who their folks are, they know who our folks are, and there's pretty routine communication.
That's interesting. I was working with a small agency earlier this week in the Lake Tahoe area. And as I was looking at the maps and all that stuff, I was like, man, the state border between Nevada and California goes right through the lake. And then you've got cities. And I was just thinking about that going into our discussion, like, man, it's just got to be next level. Just, it's hard enough sometimes to get the thing done or the service provided, let alone have to deal with multiple regulatory impacts. But on the funding side, you mentioned your mayor's heading back to DC, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that because you've been involved in advocacy at the national level. We both through the American Public Works Association, but you were the chair of that committee, and it's a volunteer committee. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that? What motivated you to get involved beyond the local role? Because there's many people in your position in their city might just say, I got enough to worry about here, and not maybe open themselves up to being effective nationally.
Yeah. Sometimes I ask myself, what the heck am I doing? I've got enough to do. What am I doing? I have a very responsible position. There's a lot of work to do locally just to keep the wheels on. I think that kind of inherent in what we've talked about, the people who are drawn to public works. I look at all the work that you do just on such a broad level, trying to promote the industry and trying to help communicate. You're not getting directly paid for that. This is stuff that, so why is it, what is it that's within us? In Spanish, there's a saying called se me nace. It's born of me. Almost like it's something that you just can't help, because if you're passionate about this stuff, you recognize that in order to effectively do this, it requires a lot of coordination and interaction on a lot of different levels. My first kind of foray into getting involved on a more national and international level was I was selected as a Jennings Randolph Fellow. And I had just seen the call for applications in an APWA reporter. I thought, well, that's really interesting. I lived in Latin America for a while. I speak fluent Spanish. I thought that might be cool. What I was really curious about, for me, I was in the middle of redrafting a surface treatment plan for our roads. There'd never been an effective surface treatment plan. It had been really difficult to get a lot of the surface treatment providers to mobilize up here. That economies of scale thing, trying to figure this thing out. And I sat there and I got wondering, how on earth, if I'm struggling in the United States, the richest country in the world with the most resources, and I'm struggling just to maintain a feasible transportation network, how are they doing it in Mexico where I'd lived? I'm like, how did they do that? Like, how on earth? And so I'd written this proposal, and I was able to go down to Ixtapan and Zihuatanejo, which are side-by-side towns. But the big difference is that the Mexican government has a funding mechanism for tourist towns. Exactly what I'm doing with our tourism thing. So the city's just divided with alliance, like this street on this side, your Ixtapa is on this side, your Zihuatanejo, and Ixtapa got the tourist funds and Zihuatanejo didn't. And so it was just a really interesting thing to go and chat with the folks and try and see the differences between Ixtapa that had some decent federal funding for roadways and Zihuatanejo that was just kind of like, good luck, guys, figure it out. And so I came back from that just inspired, just looking at the differences between those things and looking how policy really matters. That on a fundamental level, creative public works people are going to do incredible work. And those creative people in Zihuatanejo knew how to stretch a dollar like nobody else, because when you don't have the ability to just go buy exactly what you need, you have to get creative. And we've all been in that situation where it's like, okay, there's no tool for this, or the tool's really expensive. All right, well, I guess if I take this together and tack that together, I can make this work. And I watched that to such an incredible level in Zihuatanejo, but it really got me thinking about, okay, but what if you can combine that creativity with appropriate resources? And so looking at that policy and the impact of policy got me more interested. And so I got involved in government affairs and ended up chairing that committee for a couple of years. And from there, thought I was going to take a break from committees, but had some conversations and government affairs came up. And I thought, you know what, that's worthwhile. That's a place to put some energy. Yeah, I think sometimes it feels like maybe it's crazy, but I can't help myself. I do believe so much in infrastructure and in the ultimate impact of infrastructure, which is just our ability to be with each other. Knowing the impact of policy, I can't help but try and get involved in it.
Sure. And to maximize your impact, you have to at least understand all the levels. And because you enjoy that so much, you're on another committee, right? You want to talk about that real quick? You're still given your time.
Yeah, I'm chairing the Small Cities Rural Communities Committee. I came onto the committee, had a year on the committee, and then our chair ended up needing to step down, and they asked me if I'd chair it, and I'm still figuring my way through it, but enjoying it. It's a great group. As someone who my whole career, I've worked in small cities, rural communities. APWA classifies that as 50,000 residents or fewer. And just some of the unique challenges that we face in providing the same infrastructure, but just doing it with fewer people and often fewer resources. It's a lot of fun. We had the opportunity. We went on a trip, but we call it Small Cities, Rural Communities on the Road. It's so hard for those communities sometimes to come to us. And so we went to them and had listening sessions. And we went to rural Iowa and sat down with just different entities. And it's so inspiring, man. Public works people are the best. You just sit down with these people that are so committed to their systems, and they're just facing these enormous Herculean odds to try and just deliver these services. And they are so committed, and it's inspiring. Every time I talk to them, I've just come away thinking, oh my gosh, this is neat. And it's something I appreciate about APWA too. It's just like the willingness to fund something like that so that we can have our finger on the pulse and say, how do we best serve these communities? How is it that we can best engage with them and try and provide them with whatever support we can so that they can accomplish this really huge task?
Yeah, that's important. And on behalf of the country, thank you for those efforts, because you're not getting paid any extra for that, we know. I wanted to talk to you, though, about lessons learned and what you can do through your leadership. You mentioned just now some things that you might have learned or seen as you've toured across the country, meeting with folks. So happy to get your feedback on that. But from everything you've experienced, what are a few lessons you've learned from a leadership perspective that stand out that you want to share?
One of the things I mentioned earlier, I've had a lot of great mentors through my career in public works. I was very lucky. In particular, the public works director at the second city that I went and worked for, his name's Mike Child. And Mike retired recently, a couple years ago. Inspirational. Just one of those public works guys that was just unsung hero, worked for the same community for 30 something years. But I think one of the things that really made Mike stand out to me was that Mike was a very secure leader. We talked a little bit before. I think secure leaders push opportunities. They're not credit hogs. They want their people to have credit. They want to identify who can do this better than me. When I leave, I want someone who can step in and do it so much better than me. And I recognize the talent of people that can. I had a meeting earlier, I guess yesterday, with one of my direct reports, and brilliant younger guy. He's in his early 30s and he's managing my sewer department. Really bright guy. And I talked to him about, okay, who steps into your role? Who's after you? Who's the next guy up? And I think that those conversations can be a little weird when you're talking to someone that is young in their career, young in their position, and you hope stays until they retire in the position. But having that mindset of what we do outlives us. And so I think that instilling that confident leadership is leadership that gives opportunities, holds people accountable, but only after giving them the right tools, the right training, the right know-how, charting that course and saying, yeah, grow, blossom, flourish. And then authenticity. I think that's really important for any leader, but I think in particular public works, because like you said, we don't live in this ephemeral world of the make-believe. We live in the world of, we have to take numbers on paper and turn it into roads, and we have to turn it into water, and we have to turn it into sewer, and we have to turn it into parks. That's a big task. That's a scary thing, because a lot of people get to live in the ephemeral, in the theoretical, their whole career. We don't get to. We have to turn it into something physically tangible that works. And we're going to get judged on if it works because everybody interacts with our systems. And so we don't get to hide. There's no hiding it. It either worked or it didn't. And it's really visible when we make mistakes. And so I think that authenticity in our realm is really important, that we're able to be honest about what we're doing, be honest about our intentions, communicate well. I think it's really critical, in particular with public works.
Great points. I like what you talked about from a succession planning standpoint, as a reminder that succession planning doesn't start when the person retires, right? You have to be building that bench every day, which is great that you're getting your teams to think about that. The other, I just think, objective, factual, true point on authenticity is, and you mentioned this, but your infrastructure is going to speak whether you're being authentic or not. So there's really nothing to hide behind. Your stuff works or your stuff doesn't work, or you're trying to improve your stuff so it works better. And there's really nothing to hide behind at the end of the day, right? The end users will force authenticity, and then you're left with, I'm either going to do that or I'm gonna have to pick another career.
Exactly. There's a real brutal and swift accountability in this career field.
Yeah. So I like that. Having thought about all those things, do you have additional thoughts about what makes a really good public works leader today? So let's put authenticity on the table. We want them to be authentic.
I think we live in a unique time when we've seen an evolution. I think both of you and I are probably in this boat where every other major human revolution, agricultural, the printing press, the industrial, took place over the course of centuries or millennia. The agricultural took 10,000 years to get from one spot to the other. We had time to really adapt to those revolutions. The technological revolution happened now. Like, it happened in a pinprick in history. When I started my public works career, I didn't have a city email address. Like, they didn't assign me a city email address. I didn't get my first city cell phone until 3 years into my career. And that was just a Nokia blue thing. My first smartphone was a BlackBerry bought for me by a city when I was already supervising departments. And that transition, I think, amplified a need that was already there, but it really laid it bare, which is, I think, to be a good public works leader now, you also have to have the capability to communicate externally. I think that is absolutely critical, that we can't just be behind. Gone are the days of, well, if they don't know we're here, we're doing our job. You don't get to do that anymore. I think we have to be better at communicating in the ways people want to be communicated with, which is why I applaud you just even doing this, having different means of communication where we get to talk about these things, where you can tell the public works story, tell the importance of infrastructure, talk about those things fluently, and be able to recognize which are your critical and key audiences and how you can reach them. I think if you're in a leadership position in public works, it behooves you to have that skill set. And if you don't have it, you got to develop it, because I think it's absolutely critical that we externally engage with the people that are going to make decisions about how those things work.
Great points. You talked about adaptability. You've got to be able to adapt, right? The change is exponential. It's not linear. AI is up next. But the constituency, your populations, are getting their news, quote, news, from external sources, right? They're looking at their phone. That's how they're getting their news. And video medium, like we're doing today, is the number one way people get their information. So if you as a city are not participating in that medium or in that space, you can put your article in a newspaper, no offense to newspapers, you can put it on the local news, no offense to local news, but the percentage of people that are going to see that is pretty small, right? And it's not then going to live like some things you might do socially. And we're not talking about just posting to post, but we're talking about trying to be engaging in that medium, right?
100%. I think that there will be a narrative. What you get to decide is if you contribute and if there's an official version of a narrative, because in a vacuum of an official narrative, that gets backfilled. So you either get ignored or you get a narrative that you have no control over. you don't have the option to just opt out. Like those are your two options. You're either getting ignored or someone else is backfilling a narrative because you haven't put a narrative out there. We're working on a big water alternative supply project. It's just a case study in technical truth versus practical truth. And when those two get misaligned, the practical truth eats the technical truth's lunch all day long. There have been multiple proposals over the last 100 years to solve this water problem. And every time the technical truth raced out in front of the practical truth. And so the first time a farmer saw a proposal for a reservoir that had his land underwater was when it hit the paper. And then all of a sudden you got a bunch of angry farmers. And if you want to kill a project, find yourself some angry farmers and they'll kill a project every time. Yeah. And so it's been a really cool practice in trying to keep those two aspects aligned and making sure that the coordination, the education, and to your point, we've got a multi-pronged communication plan that includes the newsletter and the newspaper and a website and big long technical briefs and research colloquiums with the academics. But also our most viewed are pithy, 90-second common question answer conversational video format. It can't even be somebody that seems like they're reading from a script. Hello, I am so-and-so from this and that. And well, it's just, hey, we got a water problem. Here's the history of it. Here's what we're trying to do. Here's how you can contact us if you want to know more. By far, that is the most engagement that we get is from that. And so I think we can either complain about the realities of the modern communication environment, or we can just be realistic and be like, okay, you have to communicate with people the way they want to be communicated with and embrace that.
Yeah, perception is reality, as the saying goes. So if you're not shifting that perception, then you're going to deal with somebody else's reality. And public agencies, especially, they have an advantage in that you can go to where the issue is or the problem or whatever that thing is, the valve not working. And you can go to it and you can point the camera and Tyler can say, here's the problem. People might have said whatever they've been saying in the ether, but here's the problem. Here's what we're working on. Here's what's going to be done, right? And there it is. You've set the narrative and you've used it objectively, and you have access to the thing that this social media, the people shooting from the balconies, they don't have that. So if your agency's not taking advantage of that, you're playing with an arm behind your back.
Well, I think a lot of times like small agencies can get really intimidated by the modern media landscape, and rightfully, because they're like, okay, like where and how do I engage? I got to have a TikTok and I got to have a Twitter and I've got to have a YouTube and I've got to have an Instagram and I've got to have a Facebook. And they start going through all this. And I think that the advice is so solid of pick the thing you can do well and do that. What people are coming to realize is that if somebody has a phone, they have access to any number of those things. It's better to do one thing really well in that space than 6 things poorly. What your entity can do well is just generate videos and upload them to YouTube. Do that. You don't have to do everything if you can't do it well. And so when you're resource strapped, I think picking where you think the bulk of your audience is, but not just disengaging from the space because you're overwhelmed by all of the choice within there.
Good points. Good points. And that leads me into my next question, which is about the future. This is something that was our future. Now we live it today, looking ahead. As we think about the future, what excites you the most about the changes that might occur in public works or the impacts that could be to public works?
I think that it's oddly enough, and in a time where there is a lot of insecurity and instability, one of the things that I've always found comforting about a career in public works is the inherent stability necessary in what we do. That no matter what happens with whatever system, no matter what the impacts are on the workforce with AI, like people still are going to need water. Like people are still going to need transportation. These are constants that are just inherent in being a human being on the face of the planet. I'm excited because I think if we position ourselves right as an industry, more and more people are going to start to, one, realize, and two, just be drawn to that stability. Hey, this is at its most basic level, this is good government. This is the most humanist endeavor that we can engage in. It's just making sure that we have the basic life-sustaining systems that allow us to be here together. And so I think there's a real opportunity as an industry for us to really lean in and lean into that narrative in uncertain times and be like, hey, we're still here. You're still drinking clean water. You're still driving on safe roads. Sewers still getting treated. We're looking out for the environment, and just really be the adults in the room through the process. And I think that's what our industry historically has been so good at. And I think that we're entering a phase where that if positioned right, can be so much more visible. And when it's more visible, I think that there'll be a tendency to prioritize it more and to make sure that the necessary resources are put to it so that we can have those systems function and function well in perpetuity.
Good points. Speaking of being the adult in the room, or however you want to characterize it, the truth in public works can impact safety, right? So with narratives, with videos, with headlines, if you don't have somebody that can still be upfront and say, this is what we have to consider and what should be done, then you start to get non-experts giving opinions, and you don't want to design a bridge based on opinions.
Yeah.
So that is going to be crucial, I think, and good points on how public works can help even into the future. But what other challenges do you think public agencies should be preparing for right now?
I think acutely, we're at a time where economic instability could be a reality for us. Looking at fuel prices, our entire industry is so impacted by fuel prices. So really thinking strategically about what the next few years look like. Often opportunity shows up in those spaces, but I think agencies that have the ability to be agile, to not just get into a rote routine where it's, well, this is our capital plan, therefore we have to do X, Y, and Z, but can be a little bit agile and look at the existing milieu and be like, okay, what are the conditions right now? What have I got upcoming? Where do I need to pull my horns a little bit? Where might there be opportunities otherwise? I think that's going to be the real challenge of the next couple of years, because in the energy sector, it's going to take some time, I think, to work through some of the disruption that we're seeing. I think that in the close term, and I think that in the long term, and this is, I guess, the ancillary to what we were talking about before, if we don't navigate the cacophony correctly, I think there's the possibility that we get lost in the cacophony, that it's just, we're taken for granted. We've always been taken for granted. Those things are always going to be there. And we have a further erosion of resources and our ability to make those things always there. And it'll take some really unfortunate, acute, visible events to regain attention, which ultimately, that's what happened with public works. A bridge collapses in Minneapolis or something, like something big happens where you're like, holy cow. And then everyone's, oh, wait, there's a scorecard. Oh, shoot. Like, yeah, revisit that stuff. And so I think there's a challenge there, because I think that there is a growing cacophony. There's a demand for attention. We've developed the ability with technology to monetize eyeballs, to monetize attention. And so I think that we could get lost in that absolute overwhelming tidal wave of attention grabbing efforts. To me, I see that as a risk. I think that's a challenge that we've got to face head on.
Yeah, two, I think, really good points there. One is, for our listeners, if they don't know, oil is a big contributor to asphalt, which goes into your roads, right? So not just shipping your materials or driving to, pave your roads or snowplow your roads, but the roads themselves.
Most of the pipes in the ground are oil-based pipes. Your C900, your SDR35, your sewer pipes, your water pipes, your storm pipes, like the vast majority of those are dependent directly. They're oil products.
Good points. And then the other part of it, I think, is leaning a little bit towards asset management, understanding the condition of your system, and then planning for the future on what you're going to have to invest, how much, when, and then start down a journey to try to get those resources, because you probably don't have them all in your budget today. And so advocating, like we talked about earlier, with all the noise, you have to find a way to advocate effectively. Otherwise, you might get left behind.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something super important, Shane, which is that you can't make agile decisions if you don't have a good systems awareness of what's in your system. If an opportunity arises, oh, you know what? Corrugated metal pipe just got a lot cheaper than plastic pipe. You know what? I know exactly what pipe I've got in the ground. I've got a prioritized list for replacement. So I'm going to pivot. This money that I was going to put in a plastic pipe, it just spiked 30%. Let's accelerate our corrugated metal replacements. We can do that better. We can do that more economically. Having the ability to shuffle things based on that opportunity requires that asset management. You got to know what you've got. You got to know what can slide, what can't slide, what can accelerate, what can't. And so having your finger on the pulse of all that is really critical.
Yeah, to do all that today and tomorrow, we need people. We need a workforce. So my last question to you is, how can we attract the next generation into this important field of public works?
I'm really encouraged in this regard. If you'd asked me this 4 or 5 years ago, I was spooked. We would open a full-time benefited position, pension, health insurance, good solid job that 10 years before we'd get 80 applicants for an opening. And there was a while there where we would get 1, 2, sometimes no applicants for full-time positions. I think that we've seen a real rebound in applicants, and not just in applicants, but we're getting really quality employees. I think one of the real tricks that if you talk to my board director, I'm telling this all the time, they just roll their eyes when they hear me say it again, but hiring a personality and teaching a skill. We've talked about the type of people that are attracted to public works. Hire public works people. And I think public works people know what I'm talking about when I say public works people. Like the jerk who is highly skilled, who worked for that construction company for 20 years and can run that track hoe like nobody's business, 3 years later is still a jerk. The right personality person who you get in 3 years later is running that track hoe just as well, and he's not a culture bomb in your system. And so I think like pitching the opportunity for growth, I think there are a lot of young people right now that are a little disillusioned with the university system. They're not interested in getting into a lot of debt for a degree that they don't know that they're going to need. And we're fielding a lot of those kids that before would have been going to college, kids that got really good grades through high school, but they're just looking at it saying, I don't want to be $60,000 in debt for a degree that I might not use. And when we can communicate that, hey, this is not just a job that you have until you go find a better job. This is a career field. You come in as an apprentice, we'll pay for all your training. You're not going to have any debt. You could be a senior within 4.5 years. At that point, you're making this much money, and then you're on to leadership. And here's this path, and the ability to communicate that path forward. We've seen a real uptick in just real quality people that are more interested in that. But I think it does require us talking about these, especially the entry level to public works as a career path, not as a job. That's what I started seasonal. I was shoveling asphalt. And so when you can draw that career path out for people, say, you can take this anywhere you want to take this. There's so much breadth in public works. We have people that come in for the streets department, and then they're like, you know what? Water looks really cool. I'd like to go, I think I want to try water. And we really try and facilitate getting people where they feel like their strengths are. Having robust professional development, I think, is really helpful. It's something we've been able to communicate really clearly to our city council, is the value in that, so that we can truly tell people, hey, we're going to get you in and we're going to get you trained. We're going to give you the tools. Early on, we try and get them to a national conference. We try and get them to PQX, because I think the benefit that we see from that is really on the grand scale, it's a pretty minor investment, but it opens their mind to how large this industry is. They get there with peers and they feel that this is a bigger thing. And we see really good retention impacts from that too.
Those are really good points. Great pitch. I thought your answer might be to attract the next generation. You would put them in pre-law, and then they would realize they didn't like that. Then they would shift back over to public works.
That might be more effective. That might be way more effective.
That was good. We know you're busy. You got a lot going on in Moscow, but Tyler, we really appreciated your feedback today and perspectives and the things we talked about: leadership, advocacy, what makes Moscow such a unique place to live and serve. If listeners want to connect with you or learn more about what's happening in Moscow, what's the best way to do that?
Feel free to jump on the city's website. Google search is easy. You'll find me there. I'd love to get an email from anybody and happy to share anything that we've got over here.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks for all of your efforts at the national, I'm sure state and local levels. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in to this special episode of the Public Works Podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, be sure to subscribe, share with a colleague, and keep supporting the professionals who keep our communities running, just like Tyler's doing in Moscow, Idaho. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Shane.
We really appreciate Tyler taking the time to join us today. It was a great conversation, especially hearing how his career journey evolved, the work that he's doing in a college town environment, and the unique perspective that comes from serving in a border state community. I think what really stands out is the impact of getting involved beyond your day-to-day role, whether it's through national advocacy, volunteer efforts, or just finding ways to push the profession forward. That's something a lot of our listeners can take away and apply in their own careers. And as you heard from our discussion, Tyler and I both served on the National American Public Works Association Government Affairs Committee. He did a great job there as we tried to influence policy and attain infrastructure funding for the public works profession. Again, thank you to Tyler for sharing his story and for everything he's doing at the city of Moscow and the efforts he's making for the public works community as a whole. We'll see you next time.
All right. Here we are.
Joseph here, Public Works Podcast.
Shane here as well.
All right, so you just watched some cool content. All we need from you is to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It helps us get the message out. It helps us propagate the gospel of public works. So if you have free time, which you probably have 2 or 3 seconds, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button so more people can follow us.
That's right. All we're trying to do is highlight the public works industry.
That's it.
Make those professionals trying to improve your communities look good and raise awareness and credibility of public works.
Yes.
It's easy to do.
Once again, thanks for watching. If you have any content ideas, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments, and Shane or I will answer them within a week of you putting it in there, and we'll get you the answer that you need.
Thank you very much.